This is a quick, fun project that doesn't use many colours and has some really great techniques to create this glowing neon sign hanging in the forest. To start off with, on your palette, you'll want black, Prussian blue, cobalt turquoise light, opera rose, and titanium white. And we'll start off with that nice glowing background. For this, we're going to use the contrast between the cool turquoise and the warm hot pink to create that beautiful light. And in the background, we want to fill up most of the page with a gradient that starts with this bright blue at the bottom and slowly gets darker towards the top. We want to make sure that we're getting pretty dark by about halfway up so that we get this nice contrast against the sign that we're going to add over the top. I've used my 1/2 inch angled shader here to roughly apply these bands of colours, getting the location roughly where I want them. So we've got the lighter blue at the bottom, which is just the turquoise. Then we're transitioning to a little bit of Prussian blue added in there. And finally at the top, it's a mixture of Prussian blue and black. But there's still a tiny touch of that cobalt turquoise in there from mixing on the palette. And this gives that darker colour at the top a slight cloudiness that pushes it back in the final background. Once the page is covered, I can go back in with my clean damp brush and blend everything together more softly. For the softest blending, you're going to want a fluffy brush. And what I've done here is I've brushed a thin layer of water over the whole background. Not sopping wet, just a wet sheen. And then I'm using this old fluffy eyeshadow brush to tickle at the surface really lightly in these rounded motions. This gets those colours to blend together into something nice and soft. Keep your brush as dry as you can when you're doing this, and if your paints start to move around a little bit too much, go ahead and dry that brush off on your paper towel before continuing. When it's all blended together into something a little softer, we'll go ahead and let the background dry. We've left our background a little shy of the bottom of the page, so I'm going to fill in the colours that I want for the wet ground down here. In the centre, I'm using my same wide brush to apply a little of the opera rose with horizontal brush marks. And then either side of this, I'm going in with a little bit of the turquoise mixed with the Prussian blue. And this is going to be our puddles that are reflecting the light from the sign above. Once our background is dry, we can go ahead and add our tree silhouette. This is just black, and I've grabbed my filbert brush for this. That way I can make wider paths for the main trunk and turn the brush on its side a little for these smaller branches. And we want to make sure that we've got a branch that leans up and over this center area so we've got somewhere to hang our sign. Down here we can use the black to finish out the shape of the scene at the bottom, filling in these little bits in the corners and bringing the scene roughly rectangular on the page. We're also going to go in with a smaller brush, either a liner or a round, to begin to add some details and some silhouettes down here at the bottom to make everything look a bit more interesting. These can be whatever plant shapes you like. I've added some stems with some leaves gathered around them, some blades of grass, and some drooping leaves in the corners, along with whatever I think is going to make this edge feel like a frame outside this area. We're also going to bring these silhouettes into the middle of the scene, picking out some nice clear plant shapes against this luminous background that we've got down here. And with these, you're really just aiming for a variety of brush mark styles, so dots, lines, curved strokes, as well as a variety in the sizes of the plants and the marks that you're making. So we can have some smaller plants, but we do want some bigger plants in there as well. Behind these most bold silhouettes, I'm going to tuck in another layer of plants with a little bit of a cloudy blue. So this is the Prussian blue and a little bit of white to lighten it, to where we get this more subtle layer of details behind here. And these are the same simple plants just tucked into the background. Down at the bottom here, I'm going to take a little bit of Prussian blue to tidy up this wet area on the ground and blend it into those shadows at the edge. And I'm just using horizontal marks here to feather that dark area into this lighter reflection in the center. Now we're ready to add our first layers for our glowing neon light. And here I've used a white charcoal pencil to outline a crescent moon shape. You're going to mark it in lightly with your pencil, and then we're going to take a size 4 round brush and the opera rose, and we're going to make a chunky outline over this shape. The opera rose gets brighter as it dries, and it works perfectly for this. You can do it in other colours, but you want to make sure that you're choosing a colour that can hold its own when layering. Something like a yellow wouldn't work very well because it's a naturally semi-transparent pigment and you're not going to get this same glowing effect. The opera rose works perfectly because it layers so beautifully, and also it's a really unnatural colour to see in a scene, so we get that unexpected pop. Once you have a chunky outline, we're going to take a little bit of the opera rose and mix it with some Prussian blue. And what we want to create here is a pinkish purple that we'll use to create a glow within and around this shape. I've switched to my liner brush here so I can fill this area within the moon, and then I'm also adding this in a chunky border around the outside. When you've added this layer, we want to clean off that brush and go back with that cleaned damp brush just to feather that outside edge so we don't have a harsh line. I'm just running my damp brush around the outer edge just to get it to mix into the background colour a little. Down here at the bottom, I'm going to layer another bit of the fresh opera rose in the pink area, just so we've got a few dashes of this most vibrant colour, and I'm working in horizontal marks here again. Now we can add some illumination to all these plants and our tree silhouette. And I'm starting off here with that same dark purple colour that we used to create the glow around the sign. So the opera rose darkened with a little Prussian blue. I'm adding this colour across the tops of some of the plants that are closest, and also creating some interest in these dark shadowed areas where we can't quite see any details. If we add a few little marks here, so some small leaf shapes, some blades of grass, we can introduce some plant texture to these shadowed areas. We'll also add this colour down the trunk and on the branches that are facing the light. And I'm using quite a dry mixture here, letting that paint break apart as I move the brush away from the light, so we get this broken texture as the tree turns away from the light and into the shadows. So over the top of these lighter purple marks, we're going to go in with a little of the bright pink. And when we build light up in this way, every time we get brighter, we want those marks to cover a smaller area. Otherwise, they lose their impact. So we're going to go around all of these plants again, just sweeping a little of this brightest colour onto the closest shapes and edges. And I'm doing this with the round brush, picking out the tops of leaves, some grasses, and bringing this fantastic bright highlight onto the closest edge of the tree. So we've got this beautiful glow from the light in the scene, but in the background we've got that cool ambient light. So let's introduce that vibrant turquoise into these silhouettes as a counterpart to the pink. This is going to be the illumination on the opposite side of the tree to the neon light. And for that, we're going to take our round brush and a little bit of the cobalt turquoise light, and we're going to run a line of highlight on the other side of the trunk and the branches to where we've added that pink. This is going to lift that tree silhouette from the background. And we can go back in with the same colour and more of a dry brush application this time. And like we did with the pink, we want to create a bit of texture here on the cool side of the tree, letting the paint break apart so we get this suggestion of the rough bark that's just catching the light. If you do get a few harsh brush marks when you're adding this texture, don't worry, you can take a clean damp brush and blend over them a couple of times and they'll just soften away into that dark colour beneath. With my round brush now, I'm going to take a little bit of black and add a few leaf silhouettes to these branches that are passing over the scene. These are just going to make it a little bit more interesting where this tree layers over the edge of the background here at the top. Once you've added the ones that are further away from the light, we can switch back to that bright purple colour, so the opera rose and Prussian blue, and add a few leaves that are a little bit closer. Now I'm going to take a little bit of the pure cobalt turquoise light and add a few leafy textures up the back of the tree just to make it look like there are some plants here that are catching that cooler light. And with a slightly dulled version of the pink, I'm going to add a tether from this limb down to our sign. With our liner brush, we are now ready to go in and add our thin, bright white line to our neon sign. And this, we want to take a little bit of time and care to make as tidy as possible. We want our white line to sit in the very center of our bright pink outline. So you'll end up with a white shape with a little bit of that bright pink showing either side. And don't worry if your shape isn't perfect. We can go ahead and tidy up any wobbly lines with a little bit of the bright pink as needed. If you do need to do this, just let everything dry before you do any corrections to avoid the colours mixing together. We really want to keep the white nice and crisp and the upper rows nice and bright. I'm going to add a few little white highlights while I've got my liner brush and the white, just highlighting the very tops of some of these leaves and a few of the grasses. Also adding a few touches of white on the watery ground at the bottom here. So our scene has everything now except the rain, and we're going to add this in 3 different colours, starting with the cobalt turquoise light. For this you want your liner brush, and I recommend turning the page to where you can move your wrist the most comfortably to create these long sweeping strokes. We want to start at the bottom and sweep up towards the top of the page. This will make the start of the stroke a little heavier, and then the tail will be finer. And we want this heavy start to be pointing down for those falling raindrops. Use your cobalt turquoise to add a sprinkle of this colour around the scene, keeping it away from that light in the centre. Then we'll go back in with our opera rose and we'll add these pinky raindrops around the sign. Again, moving that page so that it's more comfortable to help keep these lines nice and consistent. Down here at the bottom where we have our puddles, I'm going to create some ripples where the rain is hitting the wet surface. For that, I've just done a couple of dashed concentric circles flattened into these oval shapes, just where a few drops of rain are extending down to the ground. With a liner brush and a little bright white, we can add a few drips to some of the leaves. And for this, I've chosen areas where they're going to be clearly visible, where they're not going to get lost in details in the background. I'm also going to add a sprinkle of raindrops with the white too. I've taken a little bit of cobalt turquoise light to boost the brightness of these plants that are growing at the back of the tree, and also to add a few swipes of this vibrant colour in the puddles at the bottom. In the background, I'm going to use the cobalt turquoise light to add a series of dotted vertical lines in various sizes. Maybe these are sparkling raindrops, maybe they're falling stars, whatever we might imagine them to be. And once we have these turquoise marks, I'm going to go over the top with a little of the bright white and use this to add a dot to some of the larger circles, making them pop in that dark background. In between all these, I'm going to add a few stars, just tiny little dots of titanium white to decorate that beautiful dark background. Our final step here is to add a sprinkle of glowing mushrooms to brighten these darker areas. For this first layer, I've used my round brush and a little of the opera rose to create the shape of the mushrooms. Just a simple cap and a stalk underneath. Then we can go in with a little bit of titanium white to create a glow beneath the cap and the little light being cast down the stem. And this makes roughly a T shape along the bottom of the mushroom and then down that top section of the stem. You can also add a quick swipe of highlight along the top of the mushroom, just a little dot here on each one on the edge facing the light. Around these I've added a sprinkle of little white spots, and then I've given the ground here a little bit of a pinkish base where the light from these glowing mushrooms is illuminating the grass. I've also added a little opera rose swipe down into this wet area beneath for a luminous reflection. Finally, I've used some Prussian blue to break up this reflection where there are some ripples in the water to finish off our glowing neon dream. If you want to learn to paint more awesome things with gouache, then check out Get Gouachey. There's hundreds of tutorials that will have you hooked on this quirky medium in no time. Until next time, happy painting!